Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you for joining us. My name is Elizabeth Hagedorn. I cover the State Department for Our Monitor, and it is my pleasure to be moderating this discussion today, which will examine the unsustainability of the camps and prisons that are home to some 12,000 suspected ISIS fighters in Syria and some 60,000 women and children who live in a state of legal limbo. First, I will introduce our terrific panel that we have here today. Directly next to me is Sonia Kush. She is the she is the Syria Response Director at Save the Children. Next, we have Sahar Atrash. She is the Senior Advocate for the Middle East at Refugees International. Then we have Fabrizio Carboni, the Regional Director for the Middle East at the International Committee of the Red Cross. And finally, Letta Taylor is an Associate Director and the Counterterrorism Lead in the Crisis and Conflict Division of Human Rights Watch. We'll begin with a discussion here on the stage, and then we'll save about 15 or so minutes at the end for your questions in the audience and also for those who are watching virtually. But first, I'd like to give our panelists a few minutes to make some opening remarks. And I think we'll kind of go down the line here. And Sonia, we'll start with you.
So thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to MBI for hosting this important event today. So just as background, Save the Children delivers programs in Al-Hol and Roj camps and in several detention facilities in Northeast Syria that hold children. You know, the physical conditions of the camps, I think, have been very well documented over the years, so I'm not going to go into those today. What I'd rather talk about is the impact of the conditions in the camps on the mental health of children. So let me do that by giving you a few examples. 8-year-old Sarah is from Australia. She lives in Roj camp with her family. And the last time I went into Roj and met her mother told me that Sarah had said she couldn't bear life in the camp anymore, and that she had asked her mother, what are the different ways that I can kill myself? We had a boy in the Huri Center who, when he went to the barber to get his haircut, he grabbed a pair of scissors and started stabbing himself. We've had children in Al-Hol camp tell us that they can't sleep at night because they're afraid that someone is going to come into their tent and kill them. We have children who just live in constant state of anxiety and have nightmares because of everything they've witnessed, including killings and beheadings. So you can get a sense that these camps are just full of constant stress and anxiety and violence. You know, this has short-term impacts on the well-being of children, but it also affects their long-term emotional and psychological development. So these children are just trapped with very few outlets for help and support. We had a case of 2 foreign boys who live in Gueran or Hasakeh prison, who told me that they spend their days recounting the plots of Avenger movies in a way to just keep their minds active and give them some kind of relief and respite from the horrific physical conditions that they live in. So when we consider the topic of this session, you know, what needs to change? What needs to change is that we need to get those children out of the camps and the prisons that they're living in. We need all parties, all countries, all entities in Northeast Syria to abide by international human rights law and standards that human rights organizations and humanitarian organizations like ourselves have all signed up to. We need those laws to be respected, and that means getting children home. We actually know that when children do get repatriated and they leave the camps and go home, there's a lot of hope for them to have a normal life. We had a case of, a German woman sent us an email recently telling us about her grandson, Zaid, who was repatriated from Northeast Syria about 2 years ago. He had been living under Save the Children's care in Al-Hol camp. And she told us, like, he's doing great. He's going to school, he's getting psychological support, he's playing soccer, and he loves his little cat. And, you know, she acknowledged it's really hard work for him to have a normal life and make him happy again, but we're really doing our best, and he's going to thrive and make it. So we've seen some good momentum on repatriation from the camps, most recently with several European countries, and also with the government of Iraq taking back more than 200 teenage boys from prisons in Northeast Syria. This is great, but we really need that momentum to continue. The rising violence in Al-Hol, and which is on the news every day, it's unsustainable, and children can't ever escape from this constant stress and pressure that they're under. It just means they're reliving their trauma and anxiety over and over again on a daily basis. So our recommendations and how things really need to change is one, that all parties need to abide by international human rights law and standards. Two, we need to remember and keep at the forefront of our minds that these children are victims of the conflict. They are not the next resurgence of ISIS in Northeast Syria. They're children. Let's not stigmatize them and tar them all with the ISIS brush. And three, let's remember our own humanity at the end of the day. I'll leave you with the words of some teenage boys in Gueran prison. Every time our teams go in, they get asked the same thing by the boys. The boys say, we've been in here for 3 years. We have no contact with our families. We have no idea even where our families are. What is the plan for us? And those boys deserve an answer.
Okay, so I'll continue from where Sonia ended. And, you know, I think what we need is really a change in the approach. I think when anyone hears about Al-Hol is mostly when there's a security incident. I think, you know, like this has been the focus. And I think what mostly need to change is this very security focused approach on Al-Hol camp. We really need to start looking at Al-Hol from a different perspective, looking at it from a humanitarian and a human perspective. And of course, there's the issue of children, but there's also the other issue of families, of women. And I think it's very important to stress that, you know, there's not a one, you know, solution fits all when it comes to women inside Al-Hol camp. And there's this tendency, you know, even here, you know, within, you know, the US debate to just lump everybody in one basket, which is not the case. Inside Al-Hol, there are so Syrians, there are Iraqis, and there are foreign fighters. And within each of these groups, there are different subgroups, and within the subgroups, there are even nuances. So there are the so-called families of ISIS, and there are, you know, non-families. So people who fled the battles, who are civilians, you know, who found themselves, you know, trapped in the conflict. But even when we talk about family of ISIS, there needs to be a deeper discussion about who the people we are talking about, you know, the women and even the children, you know. So I feel like there has been some research even about the foreign fighters, you know, not all of them have chosen or you know, some who've been smuggled or, you know, victim of smuggling, or other who've came here because of, you know, when they were teenagers. So I think we really need to start thinking deeper about all these different nuances within the camp. Other issues are related to the broader context within Syria. I don't think we can really resolve the situation inside Al-Hol if we don't start looking at the situation outside Al-Hol, you know, whether it's in the Northeast, and there is Zura and Raqqa and other places, but also the broader. And I don't want to make this impossible, but just to say that, you know, and I think, you know, my colleagues, probably Sonia and ICRC, who work in the camps, know that people sometimes, families choose not to leave the camp, not because, you know, they come from areas who've been retaken, for example, by the regime, but just because they don't have nowhere to go, because their home have been destroyed, or simply because if they leave the camp, they are not certain that they can sustain themselves and their families. So I think all these, you know, conditions, we really need to look at them. And as Sonia said, you know, from a humanitarian and from the international humanitarian law, and tackle all these conditions if we really want to find solutions for the camps. I think we'll have the chance to talk about, you know, reintegration, repatriation. I'm sure we're going to tackle all these issues. I'll stop here, but I wanted just to, you know, make these few initial comments.
A lot of ground was already covered. I mean, is this situation sustainable? And I want to share with you a bit our experience. I mean, yes. So Northeast Syria is a front line. Okay. Northeast Syria is not a peaceful place. You know, Northeast Syria, and especially if we look at the camp of Al-Hol, is on the front line. You have Turkish forces, Kurdish forces, US troops, British, Iranians, you list it. So you have this very unstable and disputed place. And in this very unstable and disputed place, you have a camp like Al-Ol, who is honestly in the middle of nowhere. You have a small village next to it called Al-Ol, but otherwise it's desertic area. And when it's cold, it's too cold. When it's hot, it's too hot. I have the impression that you never have the in-between. And so there you have 60,000 people, but in reality, you have 2/3 who are kids below 12 years old, who live in tents. I mean, we all love camping. But now 3 years, 4 years in a camp, in a tent. And also for the ones who, we regularly do distribution of tents and shelter. And there was a stage where you have tents for winter and tents for summer. And so, okay, if you had the tent for summer during summer, great. You could at least manage a bit the heat. Bad luck when winter comes. And the other way around when you receive the tents for winter, bad luck when you are in summer. The other thing also when you see at this camp, it's, I don't know if it's English, but this concept of nothingness. There's just nothing. There is no trees, there are no trees. It's barren land. You have, that's quite sorry, all those kids. You have now some buildings with Save the Children having, areas where you have education for kids, but it's, not meeting the needs of what, 35,000, 40,000 kids. And every time I go to the camp, there is just nothing. Toys, places where they can play, just nothing. And then that is the physical dimension of nothingness. And after we have the limbo, the legal limbo. So you have there 60,000 people, 40,000 kids, below 12 years old. It's really important to insist on this one. They just don't know what will happen to them. Just don't know what happens tomorrow. It's a psychological experience I wish to nobody. Not knowing what will happen to you. Are you going to stay a week, a month, a year, 10 years, 20 years? We also know that some of those kids will be separated from their family when they'll be 12. And then they move to so-called rehabilitation center, prison, detention facilities. And the question is, and then what? Are we going to keep them for the rest of their life in this situation? It's not a rhetorical question. I really think that we are in such an absurd situation where I can easily imagine that we have kids separated when they're 12, move into juvenile center, and once they are 16 or 12, moved into prison. And everybody forget about that. And this is just one fraction, one angle of this major, if not largest, child protection crisis in Northeast Syria. And we have a lot of ideas and solutions, but at the end of the day, if we need to, focus on something, it's political courage. And there are options on the table, but none of these options, all of them imply that you have to pay some political capital. In Syria, in Western countries, or wherever you are, there is a price to pay. And what we see for the time being is that not everybody is willing to pay this price. And just to close, what will happen, and we saw it with the attack in Al-Sina prison, where you have fighters from the Islamic State group detained, what will happen is that crisis will force us to take decision and act. And probably crisis situation is not the best one to take an informed decision for something so critical in humanitarian terms, in security terms, and in stability terms.
Well, I'd just like to start by saying I echo everything that my colleagues have said, and I will try to build on that a little bit, providing similar details from my own experience in Northeast Syria in May, where I visited Al-Hol, Roj, and a couple of places euphemistically labeled daycare centers and rehabilitation centers. In the so-called daycare center, I met an 11-year-old boy named Abdullah, who had scars all over his skull and in various places on his body. He was emaciated. He looked completely shocked, traumatized, hopeless. And he looked up at me and he said, "Why are we in prison?" And I didn't have the courage to answer him because your governments don't want to bring you home. But that is the answer. And as Fabrizio was noting, there is a lack of political will. As other speakers from the US government have noted earlier today, the means are there. Yes, there are technical issues. Yes, it's difficult. But this is not, repatriations are not an insurmountable problem. It's been done. It works. Human Rights Watch is also looking into what happens to children when they are repatriated, and many, as Sonia noted, are doing well. They're adjusting, but these kids are not adjusting in Al-Hol. They're not adjusting in the so-called daycare center. They're certainly not adjusting in the so-called rehabilitation centers for teenage boys or even pre-adolescent boys, these centers that Fabrizio alluded to, which are also really prisons. They just look a little nicer. But Abdullah, for example, is 11. So as early as next year, or certainly by the time he's 14, Abdullah faces the likelihood that he's going to be picked up by armed guards in the middle of the night, separated from his family, brought to one of these rehabilitation centers or a prison, and probably not see his mother or speak to her for months. I met a woman in Roj camp who just came up to me and grabbed me and said, "Please, please, can you help me find my son?" This woman broke down into tears. She said her son, who was 14, had been taken from her in the middle of the night, and she asked camp authorities again and again, "Where's my son?" They finally told her he's been taken to Garawan. This is the neighborhood, this is the prison in Hasaka in Northeast Syria, where that ISIS attacked in January. 500 people were dead. We still don't know how many among them were children. I don't know if this boy was among the dead. This mother is terrified that her boy was among the dead. She cannot get a straight answer from the authorities as to whether her son is missing, dead or alive, wounded. Many of the boys who were in the prison were wounded in this attack. Many have tuberculosis. Many were malnourished, severely malnourished. Even in Roj camp, which is supposed to be the better camp, there's not enough medicine. There's not enough medical care. Parents are desperate, kids are desperate. I met one woman who explained to me that her son, who was just standing there holding a chain link fence and staring vacantly, she said that he had tried to hang himself a week or two before with a rope tent. So this is the situation in Roj. That's the new and improved center. So think about the future of these children. Abdullah asked me a second question, which was, when will I get out of here? And again, I couldn't give him an answer, but the answer is clearly that government should go to kids like Abdullah and they should say soon, now, as soon as possible. We're really, truly working on it and do it. Now, there's a lot of kids who are from countries where if they go back, and adults who, if they go back, they face torture and other abuse if returned by the authorities. That's a more complex problem, but the perfect should not be the enemy of the good and the urgent and what's needed now. Take the kids out, with their parents who can be repatriated, work on third country settlement for the rest, work on prosecutions locally and screening of detainees. So we have a situation now where there is collective punishment. The guilty are not being judged for their individual crimes, which is a slap in the face to all victims of ISIS, and children and others who have not committed any crime are being punished for the apparent crimes of their parents. I could say a lot more, but I've gone on too long. Thank you.
Thank you all for that helpful overview of the security and humanitarian conditions in these camps and prisons. Before we get to the long-term solutions, I'd like to talk a bit more about the status of children, also those minors who are in the prisons. Sonia, you touched on the stigma, and I'm so glad you did. Much has been said about these camps serving as a breeding ground for the next generation of ISIS. How vulnerable are these children to radicalization? What more can the international community be doing to provide trauma care and psychosocial support? And is there a cost to waiting to rehabilitate and reintegrate these children?
Sure. I think the longer those kids stay in the camp, the harder it will be to reach them. You know, I think bringing them back to countries that have well-functioning justice systems that value humanity and diversity is the best thing for children to, you know, all kids, everyone wants to have a connection to someone. So why not bring them back into a society that's valuing them and showing them, you know, their worth? If you leave them in the camps, yes, the chances are they will be attracted to any group that shows them attention and care. And we're really afraid that those will be armed groups in the future. That's why it's really important to get them out now. But I don't think de-radicalization is necessarily the answer or that it can work. And I'd be happy to touch on that at some point during this panel.
Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add on that, or maybe touch on the influence that ISIS holds in the camps and perhaps how it's exploiting the conditions there?
One thing I'd like to add is that, you know, there's definitely the ideology, but, you know, all the studies that have been made about extremism, you know, and the different jihadi groups, that they breed on the feeling of resentment, injustice, you know, the sense of exclusion, you know, the other treating us in a, you know, like a really unjust and bad way, if I can say so. And I think, you know, like the conditions in the camp are really nurturing these feelings, these resentment. And I think it's very important to you know, I don't want to, you know, these kind of the narrative about the generation of ISIS and all of that. I don't want to play into that, but I just want to stress that it's not just the ideology, but it's also the other conditions within the camp that's also contributing to the risk in the camps and, you know, other places where we see the rise of extremist group. It's not just the ideology.
We had mentioned the prison attack this January in Hasaka, which I think really served as a wake-up call for many about the enduring threat posed by ISIS and its support in the area. What do you see, maybe Fabrizio, as the biggest security challenges facing the Syrian Kurdish authorities who manage these prisons and the camps? And what more can governments be doing, at least in the short term, to help better secure these facilities?
I mean, I'm not really a security expert, but, you know, there are many ways of reading the attack on Al-Sina prison and Asake prison. But one of the reading is that it's unsustainable. You know, and there I'm talking humanitarian terms, to have people, so many people detained in a place which is actually not a prison. So I think the attack, I mean, most of us working in the area, I mean, we said to many of our contact in security services that this was something waiting to happen. And it's again, because everything is kept in this limbo. You know, there is no vision, there is no sustainable approach to this crisis. And I think it started as a humanitarian crisis. for the ones who were there in the first days of the fall of Baghouz, which is this last battle with the Islamic State group, it started as a humanitarian crisis. We all thought that we were going to see 10,000 people coming out of this battlefield, and actually we ended up with 60,000 people. And they arrived in the camps and in detention places, and it was just nothing. And people just literally die when arriving there. When I say people, again, children, and I firsthand experience, we were there, I was there, it's something I will never forget. So it started as a humanitarian crisis. And the problem is that today it's still managed as a humanitarian crisis, while it's not. And there we need to have a longer term perspective, while at the same time making sure that in the short term, people survive. I mean, every day, not every day, every month, you have kids dying. In the place of detention, you have people dying of preventable disease, of burns. So it's really urgent to act, and at the same time to have a longer view on the situation, which is not a humanitarian crisis. It's a political, it's a security one, but it's not a humanitarian issue.
It seems the panel is probably in agreement here that the current approach of outsourcing these detentions indefinitely to the SDF is not the answer in the long term. So I guess my question to all of you, but maybe Letta, I'll go to you first. What do you see as the long-term political solution to this crisis?
Well, clearly repatriate everyone who can be repatriated for rehabilitation, reintegration, and prosecution as appropriate, monitoring if appropriate, find solutions which will take years for resettlement of those who can't safely return to their home countries. But I think the other urgent needs that have to be addressed in the meantime are conditions for people on the ground now, men, women, and children, all the issues that Fabrizio spoke about in terms of their medical needs and so forth, the psychosocial trauma, et cetera, that Sonia referenced. But we also need to be thinking about the right to go before a court, because not one of the foreigners, of these tens of thousands of foreigners, most of them children in Northeast Syria, have been charged with any crime. Yes, many are suspected of being ISIS fighters or other members. All are labeled so-called foreign terrorist fighters, but it's not clear what their roles are. Did they behead people, or did they scrub floors? Did they save lives, which is a permissible activity in war? What exactly was everybody doing there? And what about these kids who were told they were going to Disneyland, and the next thing they know, they end up in Northeast Syria, or were born under ISIS? They didn't choose to live there, right? So every single one of these people needs to have access to a court that can determine the necessity and legality of their detention. That is a basic first step. And a lot of home countries want to have their cake and eat it too. They say local prosecutions are the way to go, but they're not funding them. They're not supporting local authorities. Okay, that's very complicated. It's a non-state actor inside a war zone. Maybe it's not the best path, but then find another one. There was a discussion 3 years ago for a hybrid court. That didn't happen. Had that gone forward 3 years ago, there might be people being screened right now. And there's no reason, even before a court is created, that donors, the global coalition against ISIS members, other concerned parties can't try to get something going on the ground to process all these detainees, because they're really all detainees. These camps, they're not camps. They're locked. Make sure they have that access and improve the humanitarian conditions in the meantime.
Sonia, Sahar, I'd love to bring you into this as well. Some of the governments who've been reluctant to repatriate their nationals cite domestic political concerns. They cite the challenges of confirming parentage, the dangers of sending their own people maybe into these camps to retrieve the children. And then when it comes to prosecutions on their home soil, they cite the lack of battlefield evidence. What is your kind of response to some of that pushback?
Go ahead.
Like on the repatriation, I think, like there are definitely challenges. But again, I think what Fabrizio mentioned, there's the main problem is the political will. Like I don't think the foreign governments mostly are interested in bringing a big problem, but maybe not that big. It's bringing it home. There's definitely challenges when it comes to, like proving, the connections. I think one of the main challenges when it comes and when I mentioned the nuances among the group, it's not an easy, process. Like how do you differentiate between the different connections to ISIS? What has been committed and what has not been committed? We know that, among accusations, there has been vindication, there has been false accusations, there has been a lot of things that have been going on, whether in Syria or Iraq. So there's definitely challenges. But if I can just jump onto, the issue is not just about foreign fighters. So there's the Syrians, there's the Iraqi. When it comes to Syrian nationals, there has been attempt of reintegrations. And this is why, like I think the number of camp residents has dropped, from 73,000 to now we're talking about 55. And like the experience has been mixed, but there has been attempt for reintegration inside Syria. Iraq is trying also to repatriate some of its nationals. So, and I think Iraq probably needs some support, when it comes to its legal system, more monitoring when it comes to the, the repatriation, where the returnees are being, detained, if I can call it so. But yeah, I'll let Sonia maybe.
Well, I would agree. It comes down to political will and finding a way to enable the returns. Several European governments, after a couple of years of not much action, have found ways, each one in a way that works with their own domestic market and governments, to repatriate. And we've actually seen a big uptick this year of European governments repatriating. And so I think there are lessons learned on how those governments have done it. It really comes down to political will and governments being willing to abide by their responsibilities under international human rights law.
Some governments and some experts have advocated for making the priority bringing home children first, even if that means separating them from their moms. I wonder what the panel thinks of that approach.
I'd love to say that, but Sonia, I think that's save the children.
Yeah, save the
Sure.
children. That's on you. That's on you.
Well, I mean, for us, obviously, the child's best interest is always paramount in any decision making. And so if there was to be sort of a suggestion that a child be separated from their mother, there would have to be a very sophisticated, detailed process to determine that it was in the best interest of that child to remove them from their mother. And that is impossible to do right now in Northeast Syria at all. So it's that for us, it's a non-starter to look at that as a solution to start bringing children home without their parents. The mothers are the only constant presence in the child's life for the last several years. Removing them would set them back emotionally, developmentally. And so our strong recommendation, request, demand is always take the mothers with the children. And once they're back in sophisticated countries with social services, then you can figure out what is really in the best interest of the child, but you can't make that determination in Northeast Syria.
Len, I know we were talking about this earlier. Do you have anything you want to add on this?
Well, no, I absolutely agree. And I just also wanted to follow up on your comment on the lack of battlefield evidence, because it's very interesting that so many countries say, well, there's not enough evidence. We don't know how to prosecute these people. And yet, so somehow that means it's okay to leave people indefinitely detained with no due process whatsoever in human conditions, life-threatening conditions, including children who grow up to be adults who could spend the rest of their adult lives and die in these same decrepit prisons inside a war zone. So is that the choice? Because it's difficult to find evidence. The solution is to abandon people like they're a piece of trash. This is really what we're looking at here. So I get it that it's difficult, but the job of governance is it's not always easy, right? We have a Guantanamo here in terms of the indefinite unlawful detention aspect. And Guantanamo had a total of 700 people go in and out. And there are still several left 20 years later. We are looking at 60,000 people. And none of the foreigners has been charged with a crime brought before a court. So, okay, it's difficult, but pursue plea deals. A lot of women I spoke to just sounded broken. They said, we will go back, we will serve time, just let us go home with our kids so that we can give our kids a chance and they can come visit us in prison.
While the repatriation of foreigners is an ongoing challenge, we should also address probably the Syrians and the Iraqis who live in these camps and who make up a majority of the population of prisons and the camps. I guess to the panel here, maybe Sahar, Fabrizio, what do you see as the challenges to returning them and where possible prosecuting them, and what recommendations do you have there?
Sure. So I'll speak about the Syrians. Speak about
yeah, that's nice.
According, to interviews I conducted, it seems that the number of Syrians really, we still don't know, but so the vast majority of Syrians are civilians who fled the battles. The main challenges to reintegrating Syrians, the reintegrations of Syrians, is first, and they're going to seem, some of them are going to seem a bit, shallow, but they're not. So the housing, a lot of the, Syrians who are in the camp don't have houses to go to, either because, as I mentioned earlier, they come from regions who've been, now controlled by the Syrian regime, or because, their houses have been destroyed or are not uninhabitable anymore. The second main challenge is the living conditions outside the camp. The challenges that the returnees face now is that they go to conditions that's very difficult, not only for the returnees, but the broader population. And this prevents people really from even applying for returns. So we've seen this. There's definitely the problem of stigma within, the communities. So the community views has made, the voluntary return, if we can call it so, more challenging. But mostly also, the security situation within the region, for example, in the resort, for example, when there has been a lot of security challenges, arrests, assassinations and kidnapping by so-called sleeping cells of ISIS have made, the perceptions of the returnees being responsible at some point. So this has triggered, more, I think, suspicions within the communities. There has been processes where, for example, tribal leaders or civil society organization would just sponsor returnees, but these also has been fraught by some, rumors or evidence of corruption. So the system itself needs to be better processed and monitored. But these are all challenges to talk about the reintegrations of Syrians. It's still possible. I just think that we should keep trying, until we have the vast majority really reintegrated, and prosecute those who really there's evidence that they are involved in, crimes.
The Iraqi, I think that there is already a return, a voluntary return. So it means that people are willing to return. As you know, Iraq faces its own challenge and problem when it comes to camps and IDPs, because people are brought back to camps. There is also an issue in Iraq of stigmatization. There are questions around the rule of law. And for the remaining Iraqis, it's, are they willing to go back? And if not, what do we do with that? There is a principle of non-refoulement. It's a concept from refugee law, which says that if you have legitimate ground to believe that your mental or physical integrity would be at risk if you go back, you have the right not to go back. So I believe, yes, that the return of the Iraqi population, it's a necessity. It would help decrease the number of people in the camp, but it's not going to be easy. And this leads me to another issue, is that, yes, one of the objectives is to decrease the number of people who are in the camp and in detention. But there will be an incompressible number of people who will be stuck there. And, you know, if you look at numbers, at figures, it could be really a lot of people. What do we do with that? And I could give you a couple of answers, but I repeat, I think humanitarians, we're not the ones who should do that. You know, we shouldn't take responsibilities which are not responsibility of humanitarian actors. And we've done, I think here collectively, already a lot, and way more than what humanitarian actors are supposed to do in such an environment. So here again, it's collective responsibility. It's not an easy one. It's not an easy one to find a solution, but reducing the number, and at the same time, there are people who will stay on this front line for years to come with, in my view, little perspective to come back.
We're almost to audience questions, but I have one more on access that the humanitarian organizations like yours have to these camps and prisons, especially in light of what happened this week at the UN Security Council. I'd love to get your thought on how the closure of the Al Yarabia crossing in 2020 impacted the humanitarian response, and just today, what is the level of access that aid groups have? Any one of you would like to take that?
Well, I think we have different situations.
Yeah, right.
You know, there's a famous cross-line, cross-border, and the ICSC always decide to work from inside Syria. So we do cross-line. I think the main constraint we have, it's related to security. And this connects again to my previous point. You know, you can't have a camp or prison relying on humanitarian assistance, which can be cut at any moment because of the security reason. You know, when there was the attack on Al-Sina, most of us were stuck home in the office and couldn't move back to the camp. I mean, in this camp, there is an hospital we're running. Couldn't run this hospital for I don't know how many days or weeks. So we can't be the ones providing a reliable service to the population of this camp.
I can take it from the cross-border side. So Save the Children is a cross-border agency, which means we enter Northeast Syria through the Feshkapur or Samelka border crossing. And in general, things are working despite Yarabia having been closed. The main impact on the humanitarian operation for cross-border agencies was the medical supplies flow that stopped being brought through Yarabia. But in general, our staff and goods can go through Feshkapur. However, it's also a very tenuous border crossing. It's very affected by inter-Kurdish politics between Syria and the KRI side. And so we have had instances where Feshkapur closed, you know, for actually a few months. And that did disrupt the movement of people and supplies. So it's working, but very tenuously.
I think we'll now go to audience questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and I think they'll bring a microphone to you. And if you can introduce yourself and please keep your questions brief so that we can squeeze in as many as possible.
the guy with the bow tie always gets recognized first. My name's Peter Jakes. I'm affiliated actually with the ICSR. All morning long, we've been hearing about the need to change political will. And I've been sitting here thinking, oh, we ought to do a really terrific documentary and get it on lots of TV screens, et cetera, so that people even know this crisis exists. But in listening more, it seems to me we're not being analytically correct, because changing whose political will? If a lot of the prisoners are Syrian, changing the Syrian political will is changing the regime of Syria. If a lot of the people are scared to go back to Iraq because of the instability so there's multiple political wills. And on the one hand, everybody says, look, we shouldn't think about this as one size fits all, but the answer of just the broad phrase, I would ask you, aren't you doing exactly the same thing? Because it's not just a single political will, it's multiple political wills. And they'll change in radically different ways depending on the politics of the country or region that you're talking about.
If you allow me, I'll take a different angle. My view is that there is a collective responsibility. You know, who were the military, there is a military coalition, I think. I mean, today we have the thing that there are only individual states acting there, but I think we have the situation we have today, and it's just a neutral statement. It's not a judgment, because there was a military operation. You had many states involved, I think. And in my view, there is a collective responsibility to address the situation in Northeast Syria. I don't think that a single state can fix this. I'm convinced that it's the collective action of the various states involved that will one day, I hope, maybe solve this problem. But yeah, I think we should push a bit more this collective responsibility. For the rest, yes, I would tend to agree with you that if we go into the details, there are many states who have to, at one stage, take a decision.
Go to our next question.
Thank you so much. My name is Sina Mohammed. I'm the U.S. representative of Syrian Democratic Council. I would like to thank you, all of you, for the efforts that all the organizations are doing in the Northeast Syria and in all over Syria. We have now 100,000 of internally displaced people. It's away from the whole camp, Roj camp, all these camps. We have, again, displaced people from Ras Al Ain, from Tel Abyad, from Afrin, about 600,000. Are you going, are you working in this area, like Al Shahba area? This is for the Afrin displaced people of Afrin, 300,000 are there. Or in the other, you are doing for the other also camps in the Northeast Syria, for the Washukani camps, I think Save the Children, they are there. I would like to thank you also. I know you are there and working a good, doing a good job there, but still I would like to ask something. How long will all these organizations will be operating and working? It is not solving the problem in only offering or helping the humanitarian for these camps. So that means we have a very critical issue. We have to solve it. How can we solve the whole camp, which hold about 65,000 of the families and children and women of the radical families of the fighters of ISIS? So how long they will stay there? I think even Human Rights Watch, they talk about, even the other also organization that they talk about some, the human rights for the children in the camp. you know? Even these children, they are be raised by their moms in a very radical ideology. So we are now going to have a new generation after a few years coming out from these camps, like a whole camp. So we should, I think, see what solution we should find for all these things. For the camp of Al-Hol, for the fighter of ISIS detainees, we have 11,000 of them in our region, in Northeast Syria. No repatriation, very few of the country, no rehabilitation. I would like us, even the organization, do you have any rehabilitations programs for the children in Al-Hol camp or in other camps? Thank you so much for your efforts. Thank you.
Anyone like to touch on the rehabilitation programs to the extent that they exist in these camps?
Well, I think it's very challenging to do rehabilitation in camps, given the sheer level of, physical challenges that we have to address with just trying to get water and healthcare, et cetera. So like Save the Children does run schools. They're constantly disrupted by security incidents. We try to build in very basic level psychological, psychosocial support into our classrooms, into our nutrition programs, into our child protection programs, any way we can. But I will admit that whatever we're doing is a real drop in the bucket, and it's in no way meeting what the children in those camps actually need.
Let's try to squeeze in a couple more questions. I think we have one in the far corner there.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Nate Rosenblatt. I work at the State Department. Thank you. It was nice to see you all yesterday, and I appreciate your remarks. First, I'll just make a couple quick points and then a question. I'm so grateful for you to come here and share these difficult stories. I think for me, one of the hardest things about working on this issue is the distance from it. And I think, you're having made these issues more real. I think it's very, very important. So thank you. Second, we share your frustration. I mean, our coordinator, Tim Betts, came here this morning and, basically said, I think what you are all saying here, which is that when you look at the array of challenges in this region, the only durable solution is repatriation, rehabilitation, reintegration, and where possible, the prosecution and incarceration of those who've committed crimes. It's not an easy thing to say because there's so much there that's obviously extraordinarily difficult. My question to you is in the vein of what to do in Northeast Syria at the moment, given the conditions there, and trying to ameliorate them. Some of what's discussed is the idea of supporting de-radicalization programming, including in the detention facilities as well as the displacement camps. Has this come up for you in your work and your experience? I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I can
Go ahead.
start. It has come up a lot. In our work in detention facilities, we're often asked whether we can do de-radicalization programming, and our answer is always no, and it wouldn't work in any case. So to give you an idea of what the situation of the boys is, they have been thrown into cells for more than 3 years now with very little access to sunlight or exercise or any activities. They're crammed in these cells, almost 50 to a room. They are severely malnourished. You have 18-year-old boys who weigh 35 kilos. There's outbreaks of tuberculosis and scabies. They don't have access to proper health care. They have untreated war wounds from the prison attack in January. They have untreated war wounds from when they left Baghouz in 2019. So in that environment, the idea that you could actually do de-radicalization with them is just a non-starter. What they need right now is actually just to come down from the heightened state of stress that they're in, kind of make connections again between their mind and their body, start to feel like, normal human beings again. They actually ask us that. They will say, I don't know anything other than war pre-2019 and then living in the cell. I have no idea what a normal life looks like. So there's so much work to do with these boys just to get them to de-stress and become sort of regular functioning human beings before you can even think about de-radicalization programs. And I question whether those even work. And I'll just end by saying the premise of trying to do de-radicalization makes a huge assumption about these boys, that they're all radical. and that they're all budding ISIS. And there's been no evidence that that's actually the case.
I would go, I agree with everything. I think we're all in agreement on this and feel very strongly about it. And I would say that I think it's actually risks being counterproductive, backfiring. You're going to tell a child who doesn't have medicine, who doesn't have enough to eat, who's saying, I want to see my mommy, who hasn't seen his mom in 3 years, whose father was blown away in front of him, who had to live under ISIS, who, as I mentioned earlier, was dragged to Northeast Syria on a ruse or against his or her will. You're going to tell these people, these children, okay, you know, we're not going to fix your wound, but we're going to tell you, just say no to ISIS. I mean, really, where is the logic in that approach? So please, let's address the humanitarian conditions and make sure these kids start feeling like human beings again, and give them access to their parents and give them clean water and air. And that can then lead to reintegration if they're not thousands of miles from their homelands. And then maybe discuss what de-radicalization might be if you know whether the person even needs that. And it's such a fraught phrase. So yeah, separate, great panel. I hope you organize that one another time, because it's well worth exploring. Thank you.
Just a quick point. I think maybe use the psychosocial support instead of de-radicalization, because I think this is what the kids need. It's not de-radicalization. What they really need, because they've been through such a trauma, is psychosocial support. So,
Really great points there. I'm told we have some online questions. I think we have time for one, maybe two, if you read them together. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. We have a couple similar questions here. We have one from both Mia Bloom and Jeff Selden about if you've seen any resurgence of youth recruitment and or ISIS grooming. And then a second one from Jeff Selden on to what extent are the best practices on repatriation being shared? Is there any organization that is helping to collect and teach these best practices?
Okay, first on the youth recruitment, who would like to take that one? Letta, I saw you taking some notes. Can I toss that to you?
Mothers told me in Rouge that they were hiding their boys in tents, both because they didn't want them picked up by guards to be taken to who knows where they might never see or hear from them again, both for that and because they feared that they would be either pressured into joining cliques of hardline kids or bullied, severely bullied, and bullied takes on is with a capital B in these camps. Their violence is rife, as is sexual exploitation and violence. So mothers were extremely concerned, who I spoke to, about the potential for their children to be recruited and doing steps. There was a discussion earlier today about how mothers can radicalize their kids. There are also mothers in Al Hol and Rouge who are trying their best to keep their children from answering the ISIS siren call. So I think, again, it goes to the fact that each case is different. HRW is collecting work on reintegration, and we hope to share those findings later this year, but we're not nearly far along enough to opine, except to say that we've gathered information that there are a lot of great practices out there. It's doable.
On that second question, would any of you like to share your thoughts on best practices for repatriation?
I believe there is a group run out of the UN that actually looks at best practices of repatriation, and different member states engage in that and learn from each other.
Okay, I think we'll make those our last questions because we are about out of time here. I'm so sorry, but thank you all for joining us, both in person and virtually. Thank you to MEI for hosting today, and thank you to our panelists for shedding light on this critical issue. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.